Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our Zoom meeting. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to be talking about developing multiple choice questions, and we'll just touch on some of the basic issues. Our goal is to try and make you become better exam developers. So we're going to be talking about a whole series of different things. Now, this Zoom meeting will be recorded and put up on the website for other people to view at their own convenience. Next slide. So in terms of some of the big higher level things that we're going to be talking about is, first of all, I want to talk about the purpose of the Royal College multiple choice exams. I want to talk about the content that's best assessed for multiple choices and what shouldn't be best assessed during multiple choices, the advantages and disadvantages of multiple choices, and little tips, what things you should keep in mind while you're writing your multiple choice questions for the college or for any other kind of exam purpose. Next, please, Alice. Now, the college exams, the multiple choice exams, are really intended to test the trainees' knowledge about if they're ready for progression to training or if they are ready to become fellows, things like that. Now, our exams are based on knowledge guides and curriculums, so they're well established in terms of the content areas that we should cover. And all of our assessments should really cover information that's coming from one of those two sources. The question that we always ask ourselves, given the purpose of our exams, is how best can we assess the candidates to see if they meet the standard that they need for this progression or for this fellowship or for gaining fellowship. The idea here then is that we will assess a variety of content from a whole bunch of different areas in a really good way, so as much as multiple choice questions can, to determine if in fact they're competent and ready to move on. Okay? So again, our purpose is to see if they can meet that standard. Next slide, please, Alice. Now, multiple choices. I think all of us have written multiple choices in our training, but some people don't like multiple choices and some people just love them. Fact is that multiple choices are really, really good for some things and not so good at others. And it depends on how the questions are written and the purpose of how they're all well designed as a whole. So look, let's talk about some of the advantages of using multiple choices. Well, first of all, multiple choices are really short snippets of a whole bunch of different content. So one of the advantages is that we can have a really broad sampling of content areas. And everyone really is used to the multiple choice format, or most people are at least. From an administrative perspective, very easy to score. And they're seen as somewhat more objective than some of the other kinds of assessments. They're also designed to be reliable and valid. So it's easy for us to use a bank and try and pull up some previously used questions that we know that are working well, or take a look at some different content areas across the board and consistently be able to assess if those candidates do meet the standard, if they're able to answer those questions. Okay? Now, in terms of disadvantages, look, multiple choices can only really assess basic knowledge and application of that knowledge. They're not best for assessing things like ethics or clinical performance. They're very limited in that sense. So what we want to try and do is make sure that when we design questions, they're designed for the purpose of what a multiple choice is best at. Okay? Now, one of the things compared to other written formats is multiple choices use what we call a selected response format. That means that the answer is right in front of you. You know that the answer is going to be one of those options that you're going to pick. That's different than, let's say, a short answer question type, which answers recall. So there is no queuing at all in terms of the question. You just have to kind of know what the answer is and write it down. So there is also, because you have that selected response and you know the answers in front of you, there's always the possibility that you could be guessing. That's one of the weaknesses of multiple choices. One of the other things is that sometimes the questions that we ask aren't always interpreted the right way in terms of what the candidate sees. So there's that possible ambiguity. I know for me personally, I get very frustrated when I take a look at a multiple choice question and I know what the answer is in my head, but I don't see the option there. Or we know it's kind of worded funny, it's convoluted or whatever. Those are one of the weaknesses of multiple choices. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to make your questions a little bit more transparent and clear and make sure that the candidates know what you're actually trying to address in that question. Okay, so there are challenges to making good questions, but there's also a whole bunch of tips that we can use that we'll talk about in the next few minutes to help you make better questions. Alice. Now, take a look at this formula, the assessment formula. It says that exam score is equal to the true score plus error. So look, every time that you take an exam, there's a whole bunch of things going on. And because of our purpose is to trying to see if candidates actually meet that standard, that's the true score. But there's a couple of things that we call error that are in the way. So for example, if you ask a question that's ambiguous or confusing, that increases the error. It makes it harder for our assessment to really assess that true ability of what the candidate is. So every time I take a look at a question or some sort of a kind of a challenge in terms of assessment, I want to try and minimize the amount of error. That little extra stuff that just doesn't contribute to the assessment. If we have very good assessment practices, that error is minimized. So again, because it's just an exam and it has its limitations, we don't want things like rushing or guessing or trying to logic things out get in the way of determining the true ability of that candidate. Else? Another way of looking at this stuff, this same kind of concept, is one of irrelevant difficulty. So the idea here is that difficulty really should be directly related to the construct that's being assessed. And everything else that is getting in the way of that direct assessment is irrelevant difficulty. So again, the tricky questions, the ones that look like they're trivial, or if there's a spelling mistake, any kind of little thing that detracts them from actually showing how they are meeting that standard is something that we want to reduce. So the question then is, how do we reduce this irrelevant difficulty? Next, please. Now, there are many different kinds of multiple choice questions. What we're going to be talking about is the type A format. Next, please. Uh-oh, there's a bit of delay. Does it look like on the screen?
No.
No. Go back. Go up, hit the up button. Sorry about that. Now, now go down. So now, in the type A format, it looks like this, typically. There is a question, or a lead question and a scenario, and then there are 3 to 5 different kinds of options. Again, this is a selected response approach, where there's only going to be one correct answer of the options that are provided. Next slide, please. So here's another example. What I want to make sure is that we're on the same page with regard to nomenclature, how we actually call these different parts of the multiple choice question. So if you take a look at this question, who was the first Prime Minister of Australia? Do you guys know what the answer is? Okay, well, let's take a look. Click the button, please. Now, in terms of breaking down this question, the first part is the stem. The stem sets up the question itself, and what we prefer to have in terms of stylistic preference is that this stem is actually a question. We prefer it not to be a statement, and we want to make sure that you don't have things like blanks or colons in it. Ask a question. The next one, click please. There is a list of distractors. So the distractors are options that are included but are definitely incorrect. They're plausible, which means that someone may in fact pick them, but they're incorrect. And the last is, click again, hello, is the keyed response, the correct answer. Okay? Next, please. Now, in the type A format, we want to make sure that we have one correct response. That's the type A. The ones, multiple choice questions that aren't in that type A format are like the type B format, which is true or false. And there's also a type K question, which is like, you have like 4 options and it'll say 1 and 2 or 1 and 3 or 2 and 3, whatever. It's much more complicated. We don't want to use that mental gymnastics, and that adds irrelevant difficulty. So it shouldn't be a test of how well you could logic out the question and think it through, but rather if, in fact, they can identify the correct response. Okay? So type A questions are good. Type B, K, other ones aren't good. Okay, now on the Royal College, we also use type R questions, but we'll talk about that in another presentation. Next, please. Now, with regard to the number of options, in general, the college would like you to have 4 options. That means 1 correct response and 3 options, okay, and 3 distractors. Now, some research says that 3 options may be adequate for the multiple choice ones, meaning that there's 2 distractors and 1 correct answer. But for face validity, the college has decided they would like to have 4 options with 1 correct answer. So it may be also very much easier to create 4 options than 5. Now, there are some people who believe that you should have a number of questions of options that actually fit the content, and that does make sense, and there is some research that supports that. The fact is that if you do have a question that really says that you should have 6 options and that are all viable and they become part of the list, maybe the choice of the distractors could be very important. You could have a question that has 6 very good, plausible, incorrect statements, and it is very important to keep all 6 of them in there. However, in this circumstance for the college, we'd like you to only have 4 options. Next, please. Now, what is best using multiple choice questions? I don't know if you've seen this before, but this pyramid reflects what we call Bloom's taxonomy, and more specifically, Bloom's cognitive taxonomy. Now, what Bloom's does is it provides us with an understanding of the diversity of different kinds of cognitive challenges you can have when you're doing your assessments. So if you take a look at the bottom first, what Bloom says is the most basic stuff for you to remember, to assess is stuff that you remember. So this is recall of basic facts and basic concepts. So it is about things that you just basically have to look at and remember, and so therefore multiple choices are very good in terms of this kind of assessment. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily that remembering is easy, the easiest of all of them, because sometimes there's some really challenging concepts that are on this most basic Bloom's taxonomy level. The next point up is understanding. So understanding is about explaining and being able to take a look at these basic remembering recall facts and using them in some way. So describing and discussing, explaining, things like that. So it's a little bit more complicated than remembering, and it moves up on Bloom's taxonomy. What also you need to know about Bloom's is that if you do anything higher up, it requires all the other ones underneath it. So for example, understanding requires you to be able to recall facts. The next one up is the application level. And application basically says, take some information that you have and put it together and apply it to a unique circumstance. This, for example, is very good in terms of assessing your clinical skills. So those are very important things to think about. Now, multiple choices do application questions very well. So for example, in a lot of questions that you'll see on the exam, there's a scenario that says basically, here's a 25-year-old male comes into the clinic for blah, 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 blah. You see this, this, and this. What's the best diagnosis? And that kind of information allows you, the candidate, to apply their knowledge and then make sure that they can actually show that they're meeting the standard based on this application. The higher levels of Bloom's analysis and evaluation and creation are really more complex. I call them critical thinking type things. And these concepts are more so about designing something or putting things together, or more than just application. So those questions are usually something that's best assessed not by multiple choices, but by some other kind of assessment. So for example, if you've got a work-based assessment, you can analyze and evaluate. You can do a whole bunch of different, much more cognitively complex things using this Bloom's taxonomy. So to sum, with regard to multiple choices, try and make application questions and understand questions and remembering questions. Okay? Next slide, please. Now, why try and assess higher levels? It helps focus on key concepts and reasoning processes rather than isolated facts or trivia. Knowledge is good to know, and knowledge has to be assessed on the exam, but not that just alone. Also, if you're using higher levels, you're also already assessing some of the basic science knowledge stuff. So that means if you move up in the level in Bloom's taxonomy, you are assessing your basic remembering things, but you're doing more than just that. Now, also, application questions help discriminate between good memorizers and good users of knowledge. And we prefer to have good users of knowledge. Instead of just someone who just recalls certain things, you want to be able to use it. And that is what application does. So we have that understanding of transferring of information. Also, assessment influences how and what a candidate learns. So the higher level skills, the more applicable it is, the more the candidate could associate with what they need to know in terms of the assessments. Also, application stuff is better with regard to assessment of clinical competencies and reasoning, and that's really what we want to be able to do in terms of assessment to see if the candidates meet the standard. And the last thing is that assessing higher standards like application questions increases the face validity of the exam. One of the most common complaints from candidates is that the exam is trivial. Well, triviality is really based on taking a look at some of those questions and seeing how obscure they are. And it's not important about, the most important thing to assess is not about obscure facts necessarily, but rather how you actually use these facts. And so if you have higher level questions, they tend to be more real. And that means that the validity of the exam appears to be higher. And that's what we want. Next. Now, that's some of the things that that I want you to know about the context of the exams. Now what we're going to be doing is talking specifically about how to make good multiple choice questions. Now, with regard to multiple choice questions, we're going to start talking about the STEM. We're going to talk about different distractors, and then we're going to talk about using scenarios. And then afterwards, I'm going to give you some 5 tips to try and help you synthesize stuff and put it all together. So first of all, you need to have very well-developed stems and leading questions. We want to have good options that are plausible and incorrect, and then good scenarios. Next, please, Alex. Now, with regard to constructing an effective STEM, I'm going to give you some examples, and this will make a lot of sense to you afterwards. But look, the first thing is the STEM should ask a question. It should be answerable without looking at the questions, and that's the cover test. I'll give you some examples of that in a second. What we should try and do is avoid what I called before mental gymnastics. We don't want to have things that look tricky. So that means that we should avoid knots if possible. Try and avoid except questions, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. We don't want that. The tricky is bad because it introduces irrelevant difficulty, and that's not what we want. What we also want to do is be as straightforward as possible. So the STEM should be as free from irrelevant material as we can make it. So we don't want to make huge scenarios that have a whole bunch of red herrings and things that are irrelevant. We want to make sure that we assess what we really want to assess. And we make our questions as simple and as little reading as possible, but yet at the same time, make it challenging and make sure that we assess what we really want to assess for those questions, okay? The STEM should be clinically relevant and may have a scenario, but we'll talk more about scenarios later on. Again, the last point is about being not tricky or confusing. Next. Yeah, take a look at these 2 questions. They really assess the same things, but if you take a look at the first one, it says all but one of the following is not a perennial plant, which is not. So it has not in it, so it gets a little bit confusing. And also it says all but one and whatever. If we change the wording to say which of the following is not a perennial plant, it's much clearer. People understand what they're trying to answer. Okay? Now, the answer to this question is not hosta, not I think it's the coneflower, if I'm not mistaken. Petunias, or is petunia petunias?
I have no idea.
No, you know what? I think it's petunia. I can't remember what the right answer is. Anyhow, those are pretty good distractors if I can figure it out from here after. Next. Now, my apologies. I know this is really, really wordy, but that is in fact the point. What we've done is I've created two questions in a very similar manner, and they ask the exact same thing, but one is a lot more concise than the other one. Okay? This is not a reading test. This is about them trying to make sure that they can prove to you that they know the basic concept. The other thing that's included in the top one is a whole bunch of irrelevant material. And I think what they're trying to do is trying to confuse them a little bit to try and figure out if they can figure out the right answer. But at the end of the day, if they're able to prove to you that they understand what's going on and they come up with the right answer, that's probably more important. Okay? Next example, please. Take a look at this one. Advances in medicine, and then a colon. Remember I said I prefer to have questions? Well, this is one of the reasons why. Now, in that first question, it says advances in medicine. Remember I told you about the cover test? If you put your hands over those options, you can't tell what they're trying to ask. And in fact, the other thing that we want to talk about, and we'll talk about this in the next section, is how related all the rest of those different options are. Remember also I was talking about complex K questions? Well, see how in E it says both A and C, and this also has a none of the above? Well, those things make it much more, it makes it have the appearance of being tricky. So if we're able to clarify what we really want to say in the STEM by asking a question like the next one, it will be better. So for example, if we say, which of the following is the best answer about the advances currently being made in medicine? You now know that all the options that are available are going to be more parallel, they're going to be clearer, they're going to be less confusing, and it's going to be less tricky. And you're also, as the writer of the question, clarifying what your objective is and what you're trying to get out of this question. Okay? Next question, please. Oh, on to talking about constructing effective options. Now, what I said before, distractors should be plausible yet incorrect. The options should be concise and clear. Again, we want to try and minimize irrelevant difficulty. What we want to do is also make sure that our options are mutually exclusive and shouldn't overlap, and they should be homogeneous. So remember the last question, we had a whole bunch of things that weren't homogeneous. So what we want to do is try and make sure that we're trying to assess the same things. Number 5 says, all the above or none of the above should not be used. Now, don't ever use all the above because it's entirely mental gymnastics. But you could use none of the above, but probably try and avoid it if you can. What usually happens when you're using none of the above is it's either just tacked on as saying, hey, I can come up with 3 good distractors, I want to just throw in another one. So they use none of the above. But actually what happens is that none of the above also makes the question extremely difficult because instead of having a selected response, the answer actually might not be there. So it gets very complicated. Now, if possible, options should be presented in a logical order. So for example, you'll see if the questions have numbers in them, why have the candidate waste time trying to find the number or the thing in the order of what's being presented? Just put it in a logical order. I know that's really more of a formatting issue and can be done not by you, the subject matter expert, but by the staff when we're cleaning up the questions. But really, just try and put them in a logical order if you can. Okay? Now, the other thing is that options shouldn't contain clues that give away the answer. So things like if you have a word in the stem and a similar word, it appears in some of the responses, the options, that also gives it away. So sometimes you got to be very careful and make sure that you're not giving away clues. Again, going back to irrelevant difficulty, you want their ability to answer the question not about the clues that you give away, but rather about their knowledge of the topic area. Next house. Let's take a look at this one. A prevaricator is, and then you've got some options. I'll give you a sec to read. So the answer is A. There's a concept called test wiseness. And what test wiseness is if you're really smart about multiple choice questions, you learn a couple tricks of how to answer the question correctly without actually knowing the content. And in this circumstance, and probably the most common and the most effective test wiseness technique is to basically pick out the option that is the longest. And the reason why the longest option is probably the best is because the longest one has the most detail and is most correct. And when writing questions, if the options aren't all the same length, then the one that is the most detailed tends to be correct. So in this circumstance, the answer is A. Next, please, Al. Remember this question? This is the first or the second question that I showed you today. So it says, who was the first Prime Minister of Australia? And gave you these, oh, there's 2 Ds. Always proofread your questions. The other thing is, so it has Winston Churchill, Malcolm Turnbull, blah, blah, blah. And we also said that Sir Edmund Barton is the correct answer. Now let's think about this stuff in terms of effectiveness of the distractors. Is Winston Churchill an effective distractor? Probably not, because everyone knows, I assume, that he's not from Australia. The second one, Malcolm Turnbull. Well, if you're asking for the first Prime Minister, I don't think Malcolm is the current and the first Prime Minister, so he's already stretched off automatically, which makes your 5 options really now become only 3 viable options. So think about that in terms of effectiveness of your distractors when you're writing questions. Okay? Next. The next point is about using scenarios effectively. Now, we mentioned that scenarios are really good to promote practicality and relevance, and they're really good things to make sure that you're using, or it prompts you and makes it easier to write application questions. So clinical scenarios are really good to talk about the application of knowledge more than just simple facts, but sometimes you've got to make sure that the scenarios aren't too complex to assess what you really want to assess. And sometimes I've seen people write these huge, beautiful, great scenarios and then just ask a knowledge question that's not related to the scenario at all. What I'm asking you to do here in terms of making good questions then is to make sure that if you do write a scenario, that your question actually relates to the scenario and is an application question rather than just a knowledge question. Next, please. Take a look at this. So this is an example of what I was saying before. It basically has a scenario and then a question that's not linked to the scenario whatsoever. Try and avoid doing this. Next. Now, I mentioned to this before about the 5 rules of multiple choices. Now, I've created these ones, so what you can do is keep in your mind these 5 primary rules as opposed to listing a whole bunch of different things. So I'm going to go over them one by one. The first rule is really to focus on one content area, trying to balance and make sure that your questions are focused and you have an idea of what you're trying to assess. Number 2 is to make sure there's one correct answer. Number 3 is a cover test, and I'll go over the cover test in some detail. Then we'll talk about some other tips about distractors, and then avoiding technical flaws and avoid being tricky. Next slide, please. So, focus on one content area. Now, all the Royal College's questions should be based on a blueprint. You should have an idea of what kind of topic areas you should be picking on. And we don't want to have trivia. So the curriculum should guide you with regard to the questions and the diversity of questions that you need to have on the exam. We have what we call a blueprint that outlines what different content areas need to be on the exam. So we need to have those diversities. So if you want some inspiration, you can take a look at the knowledge guides or the curriculum and get some ideas of the topic areas that require questions in them. So that might be helpful for you. You don't want to make your questions too complex. You want to ask higher level questions, like in Bloom's taxonomy. One thing that you may want to think about is key features. And in the key features approach, what you do is you say, well, look, my intent is to assess this. And you focus from that. What kind of questions can we use from this key feature that we want to assess? What's most important? What level of difficulty, what kind of evidence and collections can we do to make sure that we're actually meeting the criteria of a really good question for this purpose? Next, please. The other thing is make sure that there's only one correct answer. Now, at the college, when we do our analysis, we actually do some statistics to determine if one question appears to be better than the other one. But one of the fundamentals really, and this probably goes with everything in life, is if you could ask a colleague to review your questions to make sure that your interpretation of what the question is the same as theirs. Okay? So some of the distractors, again, and I said this again because it's so important, that the distractors should be plausible but incorrect. But determining that they're incorrect is sometimes a little difficult. And again, going back to one of your colleagues to determine if that's the case is really good. And again, the last point is to consider the purpose of assessment, why you're assessing and what you're assessing, and the level of difficulty. So make sure that given, for example, if you're talking about a candidate who's in basic training, that the question is appropriate for the level of difficulty that you need for the exam. And one correct answer. Next, please, Alice. Here's another question. Here's another question for you to take a look at. Now, in this case, this is actually a would question. And for would questions, it's basically opinion questions. There's really no wrong answer. So when you ask which theories would you choose to apply to order or treat this patient, it really is up to you. So in this circumstance, it appears that some people would have an idea, an understanding of it, but if you're asking someone for their opinion, they really don't have a incorrect answer. Next point, please. Now, the cover test. Now, what we want to do in terms of the cover test, you'll see in a couple examples, is that these are questions where if you cover up the options, you can't tell what you're trying to assess. So in order to avoid the problems that we detect from the cover test, try and ask questions rather than statements, avoid accept questions, and try and figure out if the exam works using the cover test. And what the cover test identifies is questions that tend to have ambiguous stems that don't have clear answers, or it has a lack of homogeneity of the options, it lowers candidates' reading and perceptions of trickiness, and also it helps you focus on the content. So I'll give you a couple of examples and you'll see what I mean. So if I ask you this generic question, which of the following is correct? And I cover up the answers, I have no clue whatsoever in terms of figuring out what the correct answer is. Can you click it, Alice? Mm-hmm. Now, if I click that, then the hand goes away, and this is a question now about cats. Now, notice that all the questions are really kind of all over the place. So there's some questions about cat sounds, and some questions about how many questions there are in the world, and a whole bunch of different things, how many different breeds. Answer is, I believe that the group of cats is actually called a clouder, not a chowder. But anyhow, that said, the cover test is basically saying that this is not homogeneous, and it's it's a bit confusing. For these questions, what you'll find is there's a lot of really intense reading that the candidate has to make to try and figure out which one of those is correct. And that doesn't make them think automatically in terms of trying to figure out what the answer is. Take a look at the next question, please. So if I ask this question, which is a simple recall question using the cover test, how many groups can you compare with an independent t-test? Well, independent t-test, it's pretty straightforward. You can probably answer the question if you knew about statistics very easily. So click on the hand. So there you go. So independent t-test, 2, but you knew that before the answers were revealed. It's straightforward, and that's what you want to do. Okay, next. I saw a question exactly like this on an exam a while ago, not necessarily here at the Royal College, but it basically just said vertigo. What about vertigo? What are trying to assess about vertigo? So in terms of this stuff, using the cover test and just seeing vertigo is lacking something. It's not a good question in that sense. Okay, next. Here's another example. So for example, if you just said California, what are you trying to assess? But if you say, what's the main reason so many people moved from California in 1849, it focuses it. You understand what you're looking for, and that transparency of what you're trying to assess and their ability to understand, to be able to communicate to you that they understand that is really important. So again, this is an example of why the cover test is a good assessment of a good question. Next. Now, on to effective distractors. Good distractors can make the question difficult and effective and improve the quality of the exam. So good distractors are often hard to create, and that's why the college is trying to move from having 5 options to 4 options. The questions should be homogeneous. They should be logical and compatible and plausible, grammatically consistent. And again, like I said before, potentially in a logical order. Next, please. A couple things to avoid with regard to technical flaws. I mentioned all of the above. Now, what happens with all of the above questions is if the question's in all of the above and let's say somebody knows that A is correct and C is correct, it reduces that ability for you to test what you're testing. So whether you knew anything about B in that circumstance, you know it's all of the above, so it must be true. There's a whole series of different logical tracks that you can do for all of the above. So do not use all of the above on all the questions. I talked about all of the above before, none of the above before. Avoid double negatives. Red herrings basically is information that shouldn't be there. Opinion questions I mentioned before. Trivia is not good because trivia is by nature something that's very obscure and you don't really want to have that. Redundant words and jargon. Now, jargon is something that I haven't mentioned before, but what we want to try and do is make sure that candidates aren't distracted by saying, well, what does a blah, blah, blah stand for when you give them a series of initials? Other things to think about, try not to use words like always or never, because in terms of these absolutes, what happens is they're almost never the correct answer, okay? Look, and with regard to these technical flaws, tricky questions really erode the confidence in the exam and make it hard to define which questions, if the competence are candidates. And remember that equation that I mentioned before, because your exam score truly is your true score plus that error. And all of these different things will try and minimize the amount of error you have. Next. So these are the rules for MCQs. Now, this video is going to be available for you, and I believe the PowerPoint as well, on the Royal College websites. And we'll tell you where all of these things are at some and through some mechanism, probably through email when you become an examiner, and probably your reminder when you have your meetings. Next. So in sum, the goal of the exam is really to test knowledge and application of this knowledge to determine if the candidates meet the required standard of to progress. Look, assessments as a whole aren't perfect. There's no one assessment that assesses absolutely everything. And multiple choices for sure have their limitations. But there are ways that multiple choices can be designed to minimize this irrelevant difficulty so we can get a better understanding if that candidate's at that level of standard. Look, multiple choices have their strength. They're really good at assessing a breadth of knowledge and supplied knowledge. If there is some way that you can design a question or a whole series of breadth of questions to do that, to assess that, it would be great. Look, fundamentally, good review by your peers is a really good feedback mechanism to try and make sure that your question is as you intended it and how you planned it to be. And just those 5 rules that I've provided for you in the previous slide will probably help, will help you very much to try and construct effective STEMs options and scenarios. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. I hope that you got something out of this video. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact the college and we'll answer your questions there. Okay? Now, we're going to take some of the questions. Have there been any questions provided?
So if you've got any questions, you can send them through now.
Okay. So if you've got any questions, you can send them now and I'll be happy to address them. What we'll also do is we'll provide some other kinds of training materials for learning more about how to design both our questions and other multiple choice tips in other things. We're also providing on the website examples of how to use Exam Developer and other training materials. So thank you very much. Okay, take care and goodbye.